Greetings and salutations, friends. Today we're gonna have a little bit of a talk about magic. Now, every single one of the schools of magic in the Warhammer universe has a series of spells associated with them in Warhammer Fantasy Tabletop. Now, I'm not going to go through the spells themselves as I would with an army list. I'm not going to just go through the list of spells and tell you what it does and how it works, simply because I don't know enough about the magical system in Warhammer Total War yet to be entirely comfortable with making any real assumptions. We have had the barest of hints as to how it's going to work, but not enough for me to feel comfortable actually making a more specific video on the subject just yet. Instead, I'm going to go through the various schools of magic, tell you what they are, more or less how they work, and a little bit of the general fluffy lore around the whole magic thing. So, the natural first question is probably, what is magic? Well, a whole lot of fantasy universes will simply just shrug its shoulders and go like, well, it's magic. But thankfully, Warhammer is a little bit more refined than that, I suppose we should say. Magic is... oh, well, I should probably actually mention first anyways. There are several types of magic in the Warhammer world, or, well, various stages, really, of the Warhammer world. For example, in the earliest Warhammer books, magic was just magic. It's, it was just the, oh, it's magic, it works because die thing. And some people still prefer that. Like, there are literally people out there that will still quote from the RPG Codex as canon. Like, I'm not one of those, but, I mean, the Warhammer universe is more than big enough for people to have different opinions on how fluff and canon exists within the universe, so, in my opinion, all opinions are more or less valid. Like I've said, God knows how many times, goes from the Liber Coetica. So, the fluff you will hear here is based on the Liber Coetica, obviously. So, back to the point. What is magic? Well, magic is the warp. It is chaos energy, but it is harnessed chaos energy. And it is not the chaos energy of, the chaos gods themselves. That would be chaos magic, which is its own thing, it's its own school. Because, as I've said multiple times, the warp itself, the power of chaos itself, is not evil. It is not hostile. It is not anything. It is just energy. And how you use that energy is up to the caster. As such, several spells have been designed, more or less, over the course of the history of the Warhammer world. Several other spells are not battle spells, so they are not really in the combat magic codex. But you have examples of various schools of magic being used for different things in various fluff books. For example, you have an example of Wizards of Gold, the Lord of Metal and Alchemy, using their skills for, alchemical potions, healing draughts, balms, all kinds of these things. Or you have Celestial Mages using their skills to predict the movement of the stars, to predict weather, not just create weather from, magic, but actually go like, oh, tomorrow it's probably going to rain. Stuff like that. You have the most obvious of all, perhaps, the Amethyst Wizards, the Lore of Death, being priests. They are not people who, how to say it. Lore of Death can, of course, be used for killing things, but the role of the priests of Mor, the god of death, and more often than not, they are also wizards of the Lord of Death. They are priests. They are there to guide the soul to the afterlife, rather than, just crazy gibbering maniacs walking around killing people. The lore of death within the Empire is a perfectly acceptable lore. It's death. Death is part of life, so it is just as acceptable as the lore of life. However, necromancy is not accepted. There are technically studies on necromancy in the colleges of magic, but outright usage of necromantic powers is banned. You are not allowed to raise armies of the dead or anything along those lines. The studies of necromancy, the fluff is quite vague on this, but there are studies taking place within the colleges of magic, but one has to assume that they are under extremely controlled conditions. Of course, that doesn't prevent anything from going wrong, naturally, but it's not banned, so to say, but it's certainly not entirely legal either, and it is most definitively frowned upon. But yes, the magic in the Empire is used for the good of the Empire, and it is used for many things, not just battle. It is used for firefighting, for healing, for herding. It is used for all kinds of day-to-day activities that can be used with magic. Now, the wheels of magic themselves, Warhammer lore has always been a little vague on how they are selected, I should probably say. In Warhammer 40,000, to wield quote-unquote magic or psychic powers, you have to be born with the gift to do so. In Warhammer, it's a little bit more vague. There seem to be some sort of magic that could be more or less mastered by the common people, so to say. But you have other books that also state that, magic is something you're born with. You're born with the gift to control magic, while other books states that through sufficient, scholarly exercises, I should probably say, you can master, at the very least, basic forms of magic. I'm not saying that any farmer could read up for a few years and start throwing fireballs, but summoning heat, maybe making enough fire to start a campfire, perhaps? Possibly. The reason for this is that all of the humans and all of the creatures in the Warhammer world channel different amounts of chaos energies, and that is what fuels the spell. If you have a person who does not channel any chaos energies, he cannot use spells because he cannot grasp the chaos energies, which is what the spell is made up of. I'm sorry, my nose is a bit runny, so if you do hear sniffing, I apologize. But some individuals are extremely gifted in the ways of magic. They can summon and control larger quantities of chaos energies, which allows them to do, bigger, nastier things. Of course, a degree of study is still required to actually control the magic. I'm going to take a quote from Warhammer 40,000 here. The librarian quote, more correctly. Librarians are the sanctioned psychers of the Space Marine chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. A mind, the mind of a psyker, without, doctrine and understanding of what he is doing, is like a fortress with its gates unbarred and unguarded, through which anything can appear. In 40,000, psychic powers means that you are vulnerable to being taken over by demonic entities that live in the warp, as you are essentially a conduit for warp energies. In Warhammer, it appears to be working in a different way. Mages are far more visible to demons than normal people, but I haven't been able to find anything that says specifically that they are more vulnerable to possession. Now, of course, since it's easier for a demon to see a magic user, he is of course more vulnerable just by the simple fact that he's easier to find. But the act of possession is quite complicated, and in the form of Warhammer, it would usually require a willing host, or some sort of ritual of rather significant magnitude to actually force a demon into an unwilling body, and even then the body's not going to last very long, as the body itself, the these tiny vestiges of the mind that once was will be fighting against the demon wearing down its own body. But we're wandering a bit off the point here. So, magic is essentially chaos energies. It is the power of chaos manifested in various forms through the mental discipline of a mage, I suppose is the quickest way to say it. There are several different schools of magic, which all use different elements of the immaterium. Now, we'll start out with the nicest one, the lore of light. The wind of magic that is associated with the lore of light is the wind of Hysh. All laws have essentially three names. You have the lore name, in this case, lore of light. You have the name of the wind of magic, which is, well, how do we say this? The wizards in the Warhammer universe call the winds of magic winds because they ebb and flow. They grow in strength and they fade in strength based on multiple factors, and so they call them winds. The winds are essentially just the ebb and flow of the immaterium, so there are cases where something is called the seeds of magic in all the fluff books, because, again, ebbs and flows. But yes, the wind of Hysh. And then the I suppose, lore name, as used by the Codex in the case of Lore of Light, it is just simply light. So the whole name would be Light, Wind of Hysh, Lore of Light. The Lore of Light is the good guy lore. It is the power of order within chaos, because there are, of course, powers of order within the chaos. Everything that exists in our material world is reflected within the materium. So, yes, of course, there is order. Now, the spells of order mostly revolves around the banishment of demons and the destruction of chaos, the illumination of the world, so to say. It represents the abstract of consciousness and illumination. It is an embodiment of metaphorical ideas and meanings, which sounds really complex and philosophical and bullshitty, and yeah, it kind of is. If you want a simpler source, it's light. It is just that, light. And so it, of course, draws power from the greatest source of light available in the Warhammer universe, the sun. And as such, it is most powerful during summer, when the days are long, and during the day, and it has very limited power during the night. Again, this is the metaphorical thing speaking here. Because while there could still be light during the night, you could simply just hold a torch in front of you, the fact still remains that the night is dark and full of terrors, wink wink, and all of that. And so the power of good, order, light is weakened in the face of darkness. Practical applications of the lore of light is things like blessings, expelling demons, hauntings, poltergeists, ghosts, wights, demons, that kind of stuff, all of which do happen in the Warhammer universe to a rather disturbing degree. So if you'd want to, you could kind of compare them to priests, although that's not entirely correct. They're more like holy philosophers, really. But they do have powers over, chaos forces, impure forces. They can banish the undead, they can banish wights, shades, ghosts, demons, like I said, so they do have that role in society, and of course they have much the same role on the battlefield, using their powers of light to screw over evil things, like banishing demons, hurting the undead, or disabling them, maybe trapping them in a web of light, slowing them down, or just simply burning them to cinders, making it a fairly niche battle magic, true, but it also makes it a damn effective battle magic if used in the correct circumstances. And, of course, it also has some debuffing abilities because, well, light. If you shine a bright enough light in your enemy's face, odds are he's going to have a bit of a hard time hitting you. Next, we move to the lore of metal, and alchemy, technically. This one is the lore of gold, the wind of Khamun, and the lore of metal. It does have alchemical parts, I suppose you should say, and you might now go like, oh, but alchemy isn't technically magic. Alchemy is just, combining certain elements of our physical world and doing things, like creating gunpowder is technically alchemy. However, alchemy that is not possible in our world, as far as we've figured out so far anyways, like turning lead into gold, is possible within the Warhammer universe, which does suggest that there is an element of magic to it. Now, the possibility is that the Warhammer world simply has a different set of, elements. It has a different periodic table than our universe, and that's why you can turn lead into gold. Perfectly possible, but then again, the missing element might just be magic. Simple as that. The power of the warp that makes, well, essentially anything possible. But that's a bit of a complicated discussion to enter into when we're talking about fantasy magic, so let's try and steer it a little bit back onto more solid ground. Yes, indeed. Anyways, the lore of metal has a rather obvious use in everyday society. The transmutation of lead into gold is strictly prohibited unless under direct supervision of the government that allows it. Bretonia is not particularly keen on mages, and we don't have that much information about how magic users are allowed to, well, practice their arts in much of the Warhammer world. So we mostly base our knowledge off the Empire, and in the Empire, mages are not allowed to just transmute lead into gold willy-nilly, because, it'd fuck the economy pretty damn solid. Though they are allowed, under certain occasions, to create gold, although this is usually only done on direct order from the Imperial Mint, stuff like that. They do have slightly less economically ruinous uses, though. They are, for example, employed in the creation of armor and magical weapons. The lore of metal is, of course, pretty damn good at creating fantastic weapons and imbuing them with magical potential. Now, this is not an entirely warfare-based thing, although, of course, that's where the vast majority of their efforts will be directed, simply because, the war is pretty much constant, so warfare is pretty important, but there are mentions in various Warhammer books about more normal, everyday items, like, I believe it is the Gotrek and Felix books, but don't quote me on this, I'm not entirely sure, but there is a mention of a set of cutlery, just, normal dining utensils, a set of, steak knives, essentially, that were imbued with some sort of magic, so that they never lost their edge and could cut meat, nice and simple. Which is, it's technically somewhat offensive in nature, because, it's a knife that doesn't lose its edge, but it's literally used for carving steak and eating, so I'd consider that a relatively, normal thing. As for its offensive battlefield uses, well, the lore of metal is somewhat limited, because its offensive potential relies upon the enemy having some sort of armor made of metal that the wizard can turn against them. For example, if an enemy soldier is wearing a plate chest piece, for example. The wizard could simply just heat that plate chest piece until it's so warm it melts, which is gonna prove just a wee bit problematic for the dude wearing it, let's just say. But they also have a wide variety of buffing spells, which really is their primary thing in battle. They can debuff enemy units as well by, for example, just making their weapons rust, which again is going to prove a little bit of a problem for the enemy. But their primary thing, like I said, is the buffing of friendly units, improving their weapon skill by improving the quality of their weapons. Or there's a little interesting one called the Enchanted Blades of Iban, where the wizard simply just sharpens the weapons of everyone around him. Just literally, he goes like, okay, all of your weapons are now redonkulously sharp. Now we're into a bit more of a complicated discussion, yes? Because how does he sharpen the weapon? Well, how do you sharpen a weapon? Well, you remove stuff from the blade. You shave off the impurities. You make the edge keener. And then the question becomes, well, where the hell does the metal go? I mean, it doesn't just disappear, surely, and honestly, we're not entirely sure. We haven't had that much information about how it works on the whole esoterical plane, like, if you do sharpen a blade, where does the excess metal go? Odds are the metal is just simply burned away, using some form of, warp magic. It simply heats the blade ridiculously quickly, burning away the impurities and just leaving the metal blade behind. It's not impossible, because the warp, everything is technically possible, so that's probably how they do it, although we can't be entirely certain. For all I know, the metal just simply disappears because, well, reasons. And another thing I'd probably note, there are some minor inconsistencies within the lore of metal, because, as I said, a lot of the lore of metal's offensive power is based upon the enemy unit's armor. Now, that might only work on metal armor, you say, but it does work on Chaos Blade, which isn't technically what we would consider pure metal. It has metal elements, certainly, so it should be affected in some way, but part of it is also just good old-fashioned magic, so it should be a little bit resistant, maybe, but it is not. Is this just because, the magic is stronger, or is it just because it doesn't need to be pure metal? The lore of metal can also affect creatures with scaly skin, armor save. Now, there is of course an argument to be made that if a creature has skin so goddamn tough that it essentially works like chainmail, then there might be some metallic elements in it. But on the other hand, there is certainly an argument to be made also that it seems a little bit odd that lore of metal should be able to affect scaly skin. At the end of the day, Warhammer is a fantasy universe, and there will be some inconsistencies here and then, particularly over the course of about close to 30 years now, probably, of fluff, so yes. There will be some thing weird every now and then. But, trying to move on, the Jade Wind. The Wind of Giran, the lore of light, the color of jade. It's a druidic lore, isn't it? It's... I hesitate to use the term tree-hugging hippie nonsense, but... yeah, it's kinda what it is. It's certainly... It's not wrong. There is a crucial difference, though. The lore of life is more closely tied to the natural essence of life through the world. Because the lore of beasts is, it's still nature magic, technically, but it is more based on, the animals that live in the world, while the lore of life is more based upon the just life force of everything, including trees, flowers, and the animals to some extent, of course. Anyways, the lore of life has some pretty obvious uses in the public space as, good old-fashioned healing magic, giving cures to diseases, healing wounds. Full-on regeneration is possible, but absolutely insano hard, to the point where regenerating an entire limb is virtually impossible just for pure Lore of Life magic. If you add in a little bit of chaos magic here and there, you can certainly pull it off, but while it is certainly a rather powerful school of healing magic, waking things from the dead and, bringing back their sanity, that kind of stuff, and full-on regeneration is mostly beyond them. The Lore of Life mostly draws its power from, nature. It is particularly powered during spring and summer and when it rains, because, rain brings new life. It makes things grow. It brings things stuff to drink, obviously, and stuff like that. And in combat, it is primarily used as buffing defensive and regenerative magic. It can heal and it can protect. It can turn flesh almost as hard as stone. It can make a shield out of thorns. It can grow trees, though this requires a fair bit of magical energies, to say the absolute least. So, don't expect a forest, but, a bit of bushy terrain to hinder the enemy. They could probably pull that off. And they can also use their magic to, wake the trees and make them attack things. They could, for example, if an enemy unit was silly enough to walk into a bunch of trees, they could wake the trees to life for a short period of time, where the trees would be lashing out at the, enemies. It's not as weak a battle magic as you might think. I've had a fair bit of effect with it myself in a relatively small Empire army. It's particularly a nasty surprise for Wood Elves, as they suddenly have their, wooden allies turn against them, which is a rather delicious use of the Lore of Life, if there ever was one. Then, next, we have the Celestial, the Wind of Azure, the Lore of Heavens. Now, if you watched the Warhammer trailer, which, if you're here, you probably did, the mage you saw there, not in the beginning, but nearby Karl Franz, the guy who called down the giant blue fireball from the sky, was most likely a celestial mage, and the spell he used was probably Comet of Cassandra, which literally just pulls a comet from the sky and falls to the ground. Now, this is, of course, again, one of those areas where we have a bit of inconsistencies, because if the comet is big enough to be pulled to the ground through the atmosphere, it's going to be big enough to, severely inconvenience anyone in a very, very large radius. But the Comet of Cassandra is nowhere near that damaging, so magic, I think, is pretty much going to be the solution to that little conundrum. The celestial winds are, of course, based upon, the stars, obviously. And it is a very, very fickle wind, because it is paradoxical. It is the lore of the heavens, but is not divine magic. It is the light of the stars, but it is not light magic. It is lightning, but it is also frost, and it is also fire. It's a rather funky school of magic that requires some rather creative thinking, to say the absolute least. Which is quite handy, considering it is also heavily associated with dreams, theory, and the divination of the unknown. So, yeah, it is some pretty high-flying stuff. It is used in everyday life for these things. It is used to predict the future. It's used for rather trivial things like figuring out if it's going to rain tomorrow, to relatively more important things like who's going to be winning the next battle, stuff like that. As for its battlefield purpose, it's pretty damn potent, with spells like Ice Shard, Blizzard, Wind Blast, Uranus Thunderbolts, Comet of Cassandra, and Chain Lightning. It's a very blasty type of magic, and it's certainly quite handy in that regards. It does require a fair bit of power to actually pull off, though, so you're not going to be able to spam the spells to that much of a degree, which means that if your enemy has brought a solid magical defense, your Wind of Light is going to be pretty badly shackled. But, I like to use them as a bit of a secondary hitter. When I took a magic heavy army, I took a bunch of spammy spell users that would just try to overwhelm the enemy's defenses before I hit them with a bit of light and fire magic to blow nice large holes in their precious units. Of course, whether or not that's something we can do in Total War Warhammer, we don't know, because, that would require having some form of dispel magic, so we're not entirely sure yet. Moving on, we have Ulgu, the Grey Wind of Magic, the Lore of Shadows. Now again, Lore of Shadows. This sounds evil, doesn't it? And in a way it is, and in a way it is not. It is, much like fog, really. If you're lost in the fog, you are disoriented, you are unnerved, you are worried. I mean, where the hell are you? You could be in the middle of a bloody swamp for everything you bloody know. You could be in mortal danger. Or you could just be lost in the fog in a completely harmless meadow. It's contradictory. It's the Lord of Shadows. It's evil, because, shadows are dark and nasty, but it doesn't have to be. So, like I said, it's a very interesting lore because it has so many implications. It's one of the primary lore of the Dark Elves, which are obviously evil creatures, but just like fog, it could also be harmless, really. For example, the High Elf home of Ulthuan is protected by the Wind of Urg, the power of the Lore of Shadows, via a magical barrier of shadows around the island that, confuses would-be invaders. So again, evil offensive magic, and yet benevolent protective magic. The use of the Lord of Shadows in civilian society is mainly used to obfuscate things. They are used for, something as banal as theatre performances. And they are also used for very important government work. Like, the Lord of Shadows is literally capable of obfuscating truth. If the Imperial government don't want someone to know something, the Lord of Shadows can confuse the person into thinking that, I didn't really see anything anyway. As such, it's probably one of the lores with the least amount of, beneficial magic to the normal people, but as a battlefield tool, and even more so as a tool of governing, it is invaluable. I mean, hell, just imagine having spies that can obfuscate their presence, that can make people forget that they were there, that can confuse them, that can confuse their enemies. I mean, imagine the uses of magical fog on a battlefield. You can literally just make your enemy units get lost while protecting your own units from that same confusion. And it has possibly the best spell in the entire bloody game as far as tabletop is concerned. Occam's Mind Razor. It is a buffing spell that is, ridiculous, really, because, the way combat works in Warhammer is that you use the strength characteristic of your unit to try and wound the enemy unit. Now, most units have relatively low strength. The average strength is 3 to 4, with large monsters having like 5 to 6. There are very, 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 very few things in the game, indeed, that have strength along the lines of 8 or even 10. However, Occam's Mind Razor makes it so that you are not wounding the foe with your strength, but with the unit's leadership, and there are many units in the game with higher leadership. So if you have a unit that is within the command radius of your general, you could very easily have leadership 10, which means that you suddenly have strength 10. So suddenly your strength 2 units of goblins or whatever can kill bloody dragons. Okay? It is a fantastic spell, which is why elf armies, and particularly the dark elves, just absolutely adore it. Like, cast this on your black guards of Nagaroth with their leadership of 10, for example. Was it 10 or was it 9? Oh, either way, 9 or 10, regardless. They're now stronger than a greater demon of corn, okay? So, yeah. Insane spell. Fantastic spell. But you can't always guarantee you can have it because it's not a signature spell. Now, on that note, I should probably have mentioned earlier in the video, because, well, I'm a little bit of a scatterbrain every now and then. In Warhammer Tabletop, you can't really choose your spells. Before battle, you randomize the spells you get. But most laws, well, all laws, have one signature spell that you can pick no matter what. So, you can always guarantee having your signature spell, but you can never guarantee having the spells you want. So, you can't guarantee having Occam's Mindrazor, even if you do have a high-level Shadow Wizard. And that's probably a good thing, let's be completely honest here. Then, moving on, we arrive at the Lore of Death, the Wind of Shirsh, the Collar of Amethyst. And I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, I honestly don't know entirely how to pronounce it. But, again, the Lore of Death. Lore of Death sounds evil, doesn't it? But it isn't necessarily. Because while the Lore of Death promises us, tells us, or hell, guarantees us, that even though you will die, your physical form will crumble, your soul lives on, creation is permanent, the circle is permanent, there is life, and so there must be death. There is death, so there must be life. So, it is not an evil thing, really. You know, of course, it can be used for evil things, because after all, it is the Lord of Bloody Death, and it is empowered by death, which makes it a pretty handy battlefield magic. But it is not, as with pretty much all Chaos Forces, necessarily evil. Now, in civilian society, the Lore of Death is, of course, primarily the sending off of the soul, the burial of beloved relatives, the natural circle of life. So they act much like priests, and in fact there are priests of More, which are usually amethyst wizards. But on the battlefield, they are a fair bit more fearsome, shall we just say. With a fair few debuffing spell that quite literally just leeches the life from enemies, to terror spells that scares the shit out of them, and a few more direct damage spells. For example, their, I hesitate to use the term ultimate spell, but you could probably argue it is, the Purple Sun of Zerus, which is also known in tabletop gaming circles as the Purple Sun of Prepare Your Anus, because the Purple Sun of Zerus is really, really dangerous. It is a giant purple, well, miniature sun, really, I know, a giant miniature sun, just like the giant space hamster. Just gloss over that part, just go with your imagination. Anyways, it floats around the battlefields more or less randomly, but anything it touches, including your troops, has to take an initiative test. If they do not pass their initiative test, they die, which is really, really bad for several armies. I mean, lizardmen, dwarfs, or orcs, for example, are just scared shitless of this spell. And ogres, oh my god. I have a friend that played ogres, and we just literally just house ruled it that when I played against him I was not allowed to use the Lore of Death, because that ball of FU just bounced around the battlefield going like, oh, you have low initiative, boof, 55 points. Oh, you too, boof, 55 points. Oh, look, it's an Ogre Tyrant, boof, 200 points. So, yeah. He was not very keen on me after the first game, let's just say. It might not be quite as insane as Occam's Mindraiser, but if you're playing against the right army, the Purple Sun of Prepare Your Anus is just horrible. So I do really, really hope that if they are going to include spells like Occam's Mindraiser and the Purple Sun of Zerus, there has to be some sort of dispel system in the game, because otherwise that would just be horrible. Absolutely horrible. Speaking of horrible, the next Wind of Magic is the Wind of Ashik, the lore of fire, the color of bright. Yeah, I know bright isn't actually a color, just, imagine the color of fire, I suppose. The Wind of Ashik is a pure battle type of magic. It's pure damage. It's all about fireballs, fire cloaks, flaming swords, burning heads, bolts of burning and flaming cages and all of that nastiness. It's fire. I mean, what do you want from it? It burns stuff. It's not particularly nuanced. Although it still does have civilian uses. Users of the Winds of Ashik are firefighters, although they kinda have to be forced into the role of firefighters, because no self-respecting bright wizard is ever going to look at a fire and go like, I should really put that out. But anyways, they do fulfill a certain purpose in that regard, and they can also use basic, and I'm saying extremely basic, healing magic. And with healing, I essentially mean the cauterization of wounds, so it's gonna hurt, but you'll live. Probably. Now, on the battlefield, well, it's fire magic. What do you think it's gonna do on the battlefield? It burns things. Relatively obviously. It casts spells that burn stuff. It casts spells that scares stuff. And it casts spells that imprisons stuff while burning it. So, it's a pretty straightforward lore, everything considered. But of course, it does burn stuff. So, it's definitely a useful lore, most absolutely. I said previously that I used to have a Empire army, which was based heavily around magic. I used to have a Shadow Mage, one Lord of Shadows, one Lord of Death, and two of Fire. So, basically, I used to just scare the shit out of my enemy, going like, aha, Occam's Mindraiser! And he'd go, oh, fuck that shit, and throw all of its dispel dice at that and go like, haha, I thwarted your plan. And then I go like, you did, here, have 12 bloody fireballs. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Was quite lovely. Of course, that trick only really worked once, but it was fun the one time it worked anyways. On to the last of the classic lores of magic, we have Gur, the Amber Wind of Magic, the lore of beasts. Gur is it's bestial spirit, it's the aggression of nature, I suppose, the predator and the prey, the cycle of life, in a little bit of a different way than the lore of death. And it is rather hostile to civilization, which is why the lore of the beasts is one of the least studied lores at the Empire College of Magic. Primarily because, mostly, when somebody starts studying it, they either go like, well, this is horrible shit, and stops, or goes, wow, this is really fascinating, and then he builds himself a little hermit shack somewhere in the middle of nowhere and just, lives there to study. However, If you can entice a wizard of the Wind of Good out of his little hidey hole, he can be a pretty damn helpful little combatant, and some nations have easy access to them. The Damsels of Bretonia, for example, use the Lore of Beasts, which gives you access to a whole ton of really, really nice spells. For example, the Savage Beasts of Horror is a spell that gives a single model more strength, attacks, and of course it makes him scary. Which means that if you cast this on a Bretonian Lord, for example, with a ton of stuff kitting him out, he turns into an absolute monster. And if you also, for example, cast Pan's Impenetrable Pelt, which makes him harder to wound, now he's just an absolute beast, isn't he? And the thing is, with the Lore of Beasts, you can even turn your relatively innocent damsel into a bit of a monster. I have had some rather embarrassing defeats at the hands of Bretonian. I once had a unit of my beloved little Skaven Storm Vermin charge a unit of Bretonian men-at-arms, thinking like, oh, easy pickings, and I even get a damsel on top of it. This is beautiful, all the points. And with this, I've broken their flank, and I'll just roll up the little bastards while they're trying to work their way through my Skaven slaves. Only to have the damsel, having had cast Savage Beast, or I think it was Strength of the Bear it was called back then, or maybe it was Visen's Wild Form, I can't remember. The moral of the story is this one tiny little blonde-haired female tore my unit a new asshole so wide you could drive a train through it. And cost me the game because, it killed my general. This sprightly little female literally butchered my kitted out warlord, so that was fun. Oh, it was, honestly, because it was one of those moments where you just kind of have to go, well, damn, okay, that just happened. I can rage at many a thing, but you just can't get angry at that level of bullshit, can you? It's just so insane, you just kind of have to accept it. Now, there are a few more laws, in fact, there's a lot more laws, but they're not really bound into the Winds of Magic per se. And of course, the Chaos Gods have their own laws, except for Khorne, because Khorne doesn't really approve of magic. So there is the Lore of Nurgle, of Tzeentch, and Slaanesh, and these spells draw their power directly from the Chaos Gods themselves, and, they're Chaos spells of the Chaos God they worship. So Lord of Tzeentch has a lot of spells that changes things, or causes them to mutate horribly. The Lord of Slaanesh, well, it has a spell that makes units just spontaneously orgasm endlessly until it kills them, so, subtle. And the Lord of Nurgle, well, pretty sure you can have a relatively solid guess at what that does. There are also two other laws of magic that should probably be mentioned. The Lore of High Magic, which is Safari, and that is the proper high good boy magic. It's anti-magic, really. It is anti-chaos. It is chaos energy used against chaos. It can drain magic, and it can even turn magic items into normal items. They can literally go like, oh, that's a really fancy magical sword you have there. Bling! Now it's a stick, haha! Which makes the High Elves a rather infuriating opponent, to say the least. Then there's the complete opposite, which is Dar, the pure wind of magic, which is also called the Lore of Dark Magic. It is chaos. It is chaos in its purest form, with spells like Doombolt, Word of Pain, and Soul Stealer. So, it's pretty obvious what this one does, isn't it? It's quite nasty, to say the absolute least. And of course, the Lore of Undeath, which is essentially necromancy. It is, raising the dead, stuff like that. And these laws draw their power not from the winds of magic, but rather from a different level of the warp. The chaos magic, of course, draws their power directly from chaos. Safari draws its power from all of the winds of magic combined. It's chaos magic, but it is used against chaos magic, because with chaos, everything exists. Therefore, a form of anti-chaos chaos has to exist as well, if you get my drift. There are some somewhat more unusual laws, like greenskin magic, which is the lore of the Wa, the big and the little Wa, which draws their power from the greenskin around them. The more greenskins, and the more hyped up the greenskins are, the bigger their ripple in the warp, the more effect they have on the immaterial world, and therefore the more magical power the shamans are capable of drawing on. And there's a lore of Nehekara, which is much like the lore of undeath, really, and works by much the same principles. And then there is the lore of the Great Maw, the god of the ogres. Now, this one works because the Great Maw is a chaos power. There are enough ogres that believe fully in that the Great Maw is real and that he has magical powers to allow him to actually have magical powers, although his magic is quite weak, particularly in comparison to the actual proper gods, since he has a relatively small following, everything considered, though his relatively small following does make up for their lack in numbers with, just blind, evil, horrible ferocity. And there are two other somewhat unique lores, the lore of Plague and the lore of Ruin. Both of these are used exclusively by the Skaven, and are fueled, more or less, by the power of the Horned Rat, although the lore of Plague is definitely stealing a bit of Nurgle power. I don't think that the lore of Plague and the Plague Priests are Nurgle worshippers, or that they draw their power directly from Nurgle, but they definitely use an aspect of Nurgle power in their magic. But then again, the Great Horned Rat is no stranger to stealing other gods' thunder, so it's probably not something we should be too surprised about. There are a few other ones that are more unique, maybe I should say, or just, kind of forgotten, honestly. There was the lore of serpents, which was used by the Amazons of Lustria. This was back in 6th edition, so whether this is canon is little hard to say, but, you could certainly make an argument for it. There is the lore of Athel-Loren, which was very much so a magic system based around the Wood Elves' abilities to use trees. Like, you could literally just move trees with a spell there. It was a really good spell, and I really liked using it in combination with the lore of life, but I do believe it has been squatted in the newest codex, though I still like to think it's kind of canon, but oh well. And lastly, the lore of ice, which is used by Kislev. Now, I'm pretty damn sure this is canon, because Kislev is still canon, and Kislev has always had ice magic, so I'm pretty sure that's still a thing. Now, this has been a very rough rundown, and I'm not sure how to tackle this subject, really. Like, I could make videos very detailed on the laws of magic, but it'd mostly just be me waxing sentimentally about various pieces of fluff, so I think a general overview video is probably going to be what I'm going to do for this, and then when we get some more information about it from CA, I might try and go into a little bit more detail, if at all possible. So, that has been it for the magic video, for now at least. I have been Arch, thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you soon. Have a good day.